coming today. My name is LittleNavi. I'm a Twitch streamer and a public speaker, and I go around and do advocacy on a number of different issues, stuff like LGBTQIA inclusion online, making good gaming spaces for women online, and today I'm here to talk to you about accessibility in online gaming, or in gaming in general, sorry, because I've also done consulting work as a digital accessibility specialist with a focus on gaming. So I'm really excited that there are people here who want to hear about this because, often people are like, that's not that big of a priority. So I'm really glad that you folks are here today. I'm really excited. Before I get started, I just want to go through a few quick housekeeping things before I get into the talk. First of all, I just want to let everyone know I have a brain injury in the language. It affects the language center of my brain. So from time to time, I have to stop talking and just kind of stare at the table. And I know that's a little bit disconcerting coming from someone who does public speaking, so I just wanted to give everyone a heads up that if I stop, it's called aphasia, and it's just part of my brain injury. Like a genius, I decided it'd be a good idea to just talk for a living with a brain injury that affects my language part of my brain. So that's the first thing I just wanted to get out of the way. Secondly, I want to talk about the fact that accessibility is incredibly huge of a topic. And I couldn't talk about it all today, even if I was given all day to talk. I don't think I would be able to share with you everything that I want to talk about. So inevitably, there will be groups of people and types of disabilities and types of accessibility that I won't get a chance to talk about today, and it doesn't mean that I think that those people or types of accessibility are any less important or any less worthy of being a part of the conversation. It's just that I couldn't fit everything I wanted to in. So if you feel like when you leave this talk, you're like, Navi, how could you talk about accessibility and leave out these people? Feel free to reach out to me on any of these social media locations on my slide, and I'm always looking for more feedback on that sort of thing because I want to be as inclusive as I can. And the last thing I want to talk about is just my language choices in this talk today. In the disability community, there's a really big divide between people who prefer to be referred to using person-first language and people who prefer to be referred to using identity-first language. And without getting into too much of why that is or what the difference is, the basics is that person-first language is saying something along the lines of people with disabilities, person with autism, right? Identity-first language is saying disabled person or autistic person. And one thing that I've found as being a part of the disability community is that people who prefer person-first language often feel really disrespected by identity-first language. And people who prefer identity-first language often feel really disrespected by person-first language. So to be as inclusive as I can, I'm going to be using a little bit of a mix of both in this talk, and I just wanted to make sure everyone knows that I'm coming from a place of respect. And as always, it's important on a case-by-case basis when speaking with people that you refer to them the way that they like to be referred. But when talking to a group about a group, I'm going to use a mix. So yeah, that's pretty much all of the housekeeping. Now we can get into the talk. I'll start with the question that I'm asked the most often when I tell people that I have a passion for accessibility in gaming. And that question is, why gaming? Nobody ever asks me why accessibility, right? Because, hi, I use a wheelchair. I'm very visibly disabled. But people do say, why do you care so much about accessibility in terms of gaming? Because people see it as being a lower priority area. Oftentimes, people will talk to me and say, why don't you advocate on behalf of more elevators and more wheelchair ramps? Advocate for legislation changes. And the short answer is that I do advocate for those things. I've worked with a number of different accessibility advisory committees in government, in universities and schools. But it is true that I have a definite passion for the gaming side of accessibility. And there's really two reasons for that. The first can be broken down pretty easily in the fact that we can break down things in life pretty easily into two categories, nice-to-haves and need-to-haves. So need-to-haves are things that we need, things that sustain us, things like food, things like water, things like shelter, things like another season of Firefly. These are things we will die without, right? They are important. We need them. And then there are things that are nice to haves. Things more along the lines of meals out at fancy restaurants, and manicures, and sports cars. And if I'm being honest, this one probably belongs over there too. Another season of Firefly is maybe a nice to have. And a lot of people say that obviously video games belong in the nice to have category, right? But I argue that accessibility belongs in the need to have category. And accessibility doesn't end where gaming begins. Accessibility doesn't end where the internet begins. Somebody that I spoke to recently pointed out to me that at the end of the day, video games really boil down to fun, right? We do this because we enjoy it. It makes us happy. And I would argue that fun is what makes the difference between just living your life between just existing in your life and really living it and having the ability to enjoy it. Being able to enjoy your life is a need to have. So I'm really passionate about it for that reason. The other reason has a lot more to do with my personal story, and I'll share a little bit about this here now. I mentioned that I have obviously a visible disability. I actually have a few disabilities, but some of them don't really pertain to this talk, so I won't bore you with my long health history. But a few years ago, many years, 2014, however many years you want to call that, I was diagnosed as having had a massive ischemic stroke, which is what happens when a blood clot blocks the flow of blood to someone's brain for a certain amount of time. And when this happened to me, in like a second, my entire life changed. I'll never have the life I used to have. In a lot of ways, I've been able to recover, and there are a lot of ways that it still really impacts me. And when this type of brain damage happens, doctors don't really know whether or not it will be permanent. There are a number of factors that go into recovery, but one of the big ones is something called neuroplasticity. And that is your brain's ability to kind of rewire connections between neurons around the damage that's been done if that damage won't heal. And a big factor in neuroplasticity is being really engaged and really focused on relearning skills. Sitting there and imagining yourself moving your hand again and just trying for hours, that sort of thing. Trying really hard to relearn how to read. So the ways that it impacted my life immediately were that the entire right side of my body was paralyzed, my face, my hand, everything. I lost the ability to read, I lost the ability to write, I lost the ability to count and even understand numbers. Numbers still are a little bit of nonsense for me, but I'm getting there. And one of the biggest things was that I lost the ability to speak. So it's called aphasia. I still have it. It's what I mentioned at the beginning of this talk. But it used to be permanent, it used to be all of the time. So people could speak to me and I could understand them completely clearly, but I couldn't find the words to reply. It's sort of like if someone asks you who your favorite celebrity is, and you have their face in your mind and their name is on the tip of your tongue and you just can't quite get it. It's like that, but with every word you've ever known. So that was really frustrating. And I was teamed up with a speech-language pathologist to relearn some of these skills for the cognitive side of my disability. And I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but a lot of the tools that are developed for people to learn how to read and how to write and how to count, they're developed for 5-year-olds, right? And if neuroplasticity depends on me really being invested and focusing, it's hard for me to get invested in a book about Polly the parrot making friends at the zoo, right? I was 25 when I had my stroke. So my speech-language pathologist sat down with me and said, Navi, what do you love? Because we can find a way to incorporate what you love and figure out ways to get you reading, writing, speaking more clearly again. And I remember my eyes filled up with tears, and I told her, I love video games, but I'll never be able to play them again. I've tried. I won't be able to. I have one hand that works. I can't read. I get sensory processing overload with audio-visual. And she said, leave it with me. We're going to figure this out. She came back the next day with a big stack of comic books and graphic novels because, like picture books, they have the context with the pictures for you to learn how to read. And we sat down and we went through my Steam library of like 500 games and found a bunch of games that I could potentially play. Games that had subtitles, games that were one-handed, and the list was really small, but it was something, and it got me started, and it got me really invested. Like, if I can't learn to read these subtitles and follow along, I'm not going to get to know what's happening in this game. If I don't learn some basic math skills, I won't be able to mod my weapons correctly and wreck the arena in PvP, right? So it was a really good way, and accessibility in games is so lacking that there were so few games I could play at first. And that's when it really became apparent to me that A, accessibility is such an important tool for people who need rehabilitation. And secondly, accessibility is very lacking and needs more focus. So that's kind of why I care about gaming accessibility specifically. It's helped me a lot. But why should you care? Because I get that that might not be the same reasons for you. There are reasons that everyone should care. One of them being empathy and realizing that there are actual people out there who want to enjoy their lives and have fun. Imagine your favorite thing in the world to do, and then think that in a moment you could never be able to do it again. It's horrible. It's not fair. So empathy is a big one there. But another reason that you should care is building toward a more accessible world for a future in which you may be disabled. I recently had the pleasure of listening to David Lepofsky speak, and he's a famous lawyer in Canada. He fought for the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act to be implemented in Ontario. He's currently, even though he's retired, he's fighting for Canadians with Disabilities Act. He's constantly fighting for different legislation around digital accessibility and physical accessibility. He's the reason that the TTC reads the stops out loud. Can you tell? I think he's like Superman. I'm a big fan. I was fangirling. But he said something interesting to me. He said that we are a weird minority because we are the minority of everyone. And when I asked him to explain, he said that what he means by that is that everyone will be affected by disability at some point in their life. Whether you acquire a disability, whether you have a disability, very rarely some people might never actually have their own disabilities, but have family members with disabilities. But if you think about it, you can fall and injure yourself and have a temporary disability. As we get older, it's the nature of bodies to break down over time, and our hearing goes a little bit, and our vision isn't what it used to be. So it's a strange thing to be a part of this minority that really kind of affects everyone. And that's a big reason that everyone should care. Now, I know there are some developers at the conference today and some people who work in the video game industry, and for those folks, there are even more reasons to care. Like credibility is a really big one. Offering a better product than their competitors. Like if we think about consoles right now, there's very little going on in terms of accessibility with consoles outside of one major competitor, Xbox, right? There's not much else going on right now. And I think there's a lot of room for competition. Compliance with legislation and staying ahead of the legal curve, although I really don't want that to be the only reason that people care, but like I said, the legislation is currently changing. It's frequently happening. There are laws coming that you want to stay ahead of that curve and make sure that you can be compliant with that legislation. And then the last one that developers should care about a lot is money. And there's a lot of money to be made in accessible gaming, right? If you think about it, in 2017, video games did $108.9 billion in revenue. That's a lot of money. That's so much money. To put it kind of in perspective, in 2017, movies did $38 billion, and music did $43 billion. That's more than movies and music combined, more than Ariana Grande and Star Wars. Like, there is a lot of money. This year, we're tracking to end up at around $140 billion in revenue in video games. It's a currently massively growing industry. There's so much money there. And if you consider the fact that 15% of people worldwide identify with having a major disability, more people will eventually have disabilities, and there are people who can benefit from disability or from accessibility in games who don't have disabilities. Maybe you want subtitles because you don't want to have your headphones in, you know? There's a lot of extra money to be made there. So now that we know why it's important, this is what accessibility looks like. And unfortunately, there is no simple one answer to this question. Every disability is completely different, and disability doesn't even really exist on a spectrum. It more exists on like a galaxy with unique instances and unpredictable patterns. There are so many different ways that disability can show up. So it's really difficult to make things accessible when accessibility is such a wide topic to cover. And it's not just about physical disabilities either. It needs to go beyond things like one-handed controllers and mapping options, and think about people who have neurodivergence, think about people who have cognitive disabilities and mental illness. There are all types of disabled folks out there, right? Folks who've been diagnosed with PTSD need accessibility features in games. Autistic people need accessibility features in games. It's not just people with physical mobility issues like I have, or with the types of issues that I have. So when you realize that, it's plain to see that there's no one or two simple things you can put into a game and say, okay, now that's accessible. Rather, accessibility is a kaleidoscope of accommodations and thoughtful implementations of customizable game options. We've all probably played a game like BDO or Fallout or Monster Hunter World where you can spend a long time in the character creation screen just making your character look cool before you even touch the game, just freckles and height. And a really accessible game looks like that with customizable options, right? The more options you offer, the more accessible a game will be. I have some examples of a few recent games. I can't touch all of them because this past year, accessibility has been a little bit bigger of a focus in some of the bigger games. But a few recent games that I think do accessibility well. Celeste is a really cute platforming game. I know that text is really small, I'm sorry, I'll read it out. But I think they did something really cool with their difficulty levels in their games. They have something called assist mode, and here's what they say about it. They say, assist mode allows you to modify a game's rules to reduce its difficulty. This includes options such as slowing the game speed, granting yourself invincibility or infinite stamina, and skipping chapters entirely. Celeste was designed to be a challenging but accessible game. We believe that its difficulty is essential to the experience. We recommend playing without assist mode your first time. However, we understand that every player is different. If Celeste is inaccessible to you due to its difficulty, we hope that assist mode will allow you to still enjoy it. This wording is great because it removes the stigma from difficulty levels in games. There's this kind of idea in gaming communities that I don't like, that easy mode is for noobs, right? Easy mode means you're not a good gamer. But for a lot of people, difficulty levels in games aren't about taking a challenging game and making it easy. It's about taking an impossible game and making it still playable and fun. So especially the option to skip chapters. Imagine you start a game and 75% of the way through, there's a mini boss fight. And they enter a new game mechanic, and you do the new game mechanic, and your game crashes. And every time you get to this point in the game, your game crashes. You can never finish this game. That would be so frustrating, right? You would want your money back. You would be angry. You would demand a patch. And that's what gaming looks like for a lot of us who have disabilities. Often we don't find out till 75% of the way through where there's this one fight that we can't physically do or can't cognitively get past. So the option to skip chapters may seem silly, and the option to be invincible may seem silly to some, but it's really useful. It allows people to enjoy the whole game. Another game that I think does it really well recently, this is one of those games that I spent a long time in the customization options before I even went into the game, is Shadow of the Tomb Raider. I love the Tomb Raider games. It's one of my favorite franchises. And this one in particular, they just went over the top with accessibility features. And there's still some that are left to be desired. They have things like soft lock the camera on Lara's back so that you only have to use one joystick if you're using a controller. They have aim assist, reducing camera shake, removing vibrations, subtitles, separate subtitles for NPC characters that you can turn on and off, like really cool stuff. And they have so many options that I wanted to show you a little video clip of me scrolling through just all of the options. It's like, for anyone who can't see the screen, it's 30 seconds of me just scrolling through a post of their accessibility options. There's so much there, which is really cool. They did another really neat thing where they allow separate difficulty levels for separate parts of the game. There's puzzles, exploration, and combat. So if you have trouble in combat because things move too fast and you can't keep up, you can make that easier and still have really difficult puzzles and difficult exploration. If you are colorblind and you can't see stuff in the exploration area, but you're fine with combat and puzzles, you can make that easy. There are 4 different difficulty levels for each one, and you can change them as you play the game. So that's really awesome. Another great thing that they did is they released all of this information on their website in a format that's available for people to use screen readers and access, which is important. Sometimes information comes through in images and GIFs and things rather than something that screen readers can see. And they did this a month before they released the game. If there can't be a playable demo, it's really important that games at least let people know what the accessibility features are going to be, because we don't want to buy a game and then not be able to play it, right? So that's all I have time to talk about in terms of different games, but there are other ones who did a really good job. God of War really focused on accessibility this time around with this game. Who else recently? Oh, Spider-Man. I never want to hear again that, accessibility is going to make a game do less well, because Spider-Man has been breaking all kinds of sales records, and it's incredibly focused on accessibility, which is great too. I can't wait to play that one. I'd love to talk about more, but if you're curious about more types of implementations of customization for games, GameAccessibilityGuidelines.com is a really good website that you can go to, and it lists a bunch of different implementations based on where you should start. They list them for developer ease of access. They list them based on reach, impact, and value. Reach being how many people would this change help, impact being how much would this change help these people, and value being money. What's it going to cost you? What's it going to make you? All the money stuff. Another really good resource is somebody who actually had a really big hand in creating this website. I didn't, but my friend and colleague Ian Hamilton did, and you can follow him on Twitter at @IanHamilton_. All the cool kids put an underscore at the end of their name. You can find him on Twitter, and he's a great resource. Even just following him on Twitter, he is constantly putting out things that are really helpful. So there is accessibility that goes beyond the actual physical game that people don't talk about very often. If a game development company or somebody working in the game development industry wants to really be accessible, they need to think about things like their office space. I recently had the pleasure of meeting Tara Volker, who had a big hand in Xbox's Inclusive Tech Lab. That's where they do all of their research for things like the adaptive controller, making their console more accessible, making their games more accessible. And she explained that their tech lab has so much accessibility, like double width doors and buttons everywhere, audio cues for things, high contrast colored furniture so people with low vision can still see it. Things like their fridge has Braille, so if you reach for a Dr. Pepper, you can get a Dr. Pepper. And obviously not everyone has the budget for that, right? But I've also been to visit other game development studios, like Digital Extremes, for example. They do a really good job of making their space accessible enough, right? They have enough room for people to get around. They have accessible washrooms. You'd be surprised how many places I go that just don't even meet the local legislation level of what they legally have to do to exist as a building. A lot of people are still putting off getting their buildings up to code. So that's really important. Another thing that's important is to think about diversity in hiring practices. Not only because it's the right thing to do, not only because diversity is strength, but also because it's easier to develop an accessible game if these companies have folks who are disabled on their staff. If you have someone who is blind developing your game has to be accessible or that person can't do their job for you, right? So that's a really easy way. Even just having people on QA who are colorblind and can say, hey, boss, I can't see quest objectives, and that feels important. Things like that are really important for accessibility as well. Conventions and expos, if you're having, not you, but like people, if games are having conventions or bringing their games out to expos, it's really important that they make those spaces accessible as well. There are a lot of games that they put them at standing gaming stations, and I'm like, I want to try your demo, let me do it. And I just can't reach, right? So things like that are important. EGLX has done a good job of that. They made my wheelchair accessible room without me asking. They're great. And then disabled representation in games. How many video game characters can you think of with disabilities? And then how many of them are the goofy sidekick, or the villain, or the person being saved, the person being rescued who's so helpless? Like, I want to see more protagonists with disabilities. That's so important for folks with disabilities to see that, because we aren't just helpless, or goofy sidekicks, or villains, right? It's also really important, though, there are a lot of games who have been using disability with their protagonists and then not making their game accessible. So if your protagonist is blind, it's important for game development companies to make that game accessible for folks who are blind, right? Things that companies don't always think about. And these are things that we can give feedback on. So what can we do as gamers to make sure that video games are more accessible? One of the things is those things that I just listed are really important, and when you see developers doing them well, it's important to use your voice and let them know. Give good feedback when you see things are good. Let games know, hey, maybe I don't use your assistive tech, but I noticed that you put effort into it, and that's great, and I appreciate it as a customer. And also giving feedback when you notice that developers and game companies have missed something. It's important to be diplomatic and constructive with criticism, I believe, because it's easier to take criticism and apply it when people have been constructive and diplomatic delivering it. So keeping that in mind is important as well. But it's okay to say, hey, your game is missing some stuff, and we would like to see more. So even just tweeting. As gamers, it's important to make your game spaces accessible as well, right? If you have a clan or a guild that you run, or a Discord server, or a Twitch stream, or Twitter. My Discord server used to have a rule that people had to use push to talk, because I don't want to hear you chewing your Cheerios when I'm raiding. I don't want to hear you yell at your kids to do their homework and I'm trying to PvP over here. But I had to reassess that when I realized that a lot of folks have mobility issues that make it so that they can't use push to talk as easily. So now my Discord server has a rule that, as a general, we have push to talk the only enabled, but you can message a mod and let them know if that's something that doesn't work for you. If you find that inaccessible, let us know, and you don't have to use push to talk. Things like that are really important. Understanding ableist language is also really important, and ableist jokes. There's a lot of that in gaming communities, and people usually don't mean anything by it. As an example, before my disabilities, I didn't even know what ableism was. I was really privileged, and I didn't know that was a word. And I remember telling someone, there should be a word for when people make jokes that I'm the butt of. There should be a word for when people talk to me like I'm stupid because I'm less verbal. And my friend said there is. It's called ableism. And I had to look it up. And there are a lot of ways that I used to make really ableist jokes and use really ableist language that I've been working on changing. I used to say things like, if you can't come to the party, oh, that's lame, right? Until I started going to a doctor's office and hearing a doctor say lame about me to mean what I am. And then every time that people say lame, I know they don't mean anything bad by it. I know they're not trying to insult me, but it still hurts. It's really hard to explain, but it still hurts to hear people use a word that means bad, but that also means me. So there are a lot of insults and things that are really, really ableist that people don't even realize they're doing. If you think about how many insults you know of that are actually just disabilities, things like dumb, lame, mental, crazy, that's not great. So focusing on making your spaces a little more clear of that language, and it's not going to happen overnight. I still catch myself using ableist language a lot of the time. But that's a really important way that we can make games more accessible for people, because folks with disabilities don't want to hang out with people who make fun of us without meaning to. If you're on Twitter, there's something called alt text that you can add to all of your images. You just have to go into your settings and enable it so that people with screen readers can understand what's happening in the image that you posted. There's actually a Twitter account called Please Caption that you can follow. I follow it. It's a bot that lets you know if you've forgotten to do that when you post an image. So making the content that you show, if you're like, oh no, epic fail, and then you post a screenshot of somebody stabbing you in the face in a game, some people won't know what you're talking about if you don't add alt text. So things like that are really important too. Keep the conversation going, raise awareness, and vote. These are really important. Keeping the conversation going can be Twitter. You know, when a new game comes out, being like, oh, that game seems really cool. I wonder what the accessibility features are going to be. And then your friends will be like, oh, I never thought about that before. But it's an important thing to think about. And then voting. I'm always telling people that it's important to understand what's going on in your local politics and vote for a number of reasons. But voting is really important for accessibility in games as well, because currently, like I was talking about earlier, there's legislation being built right now about accessibility in digital spaces. And it's important to know how different people feel about that and use your vote in an educated way. So I'm always telling everybody to vote. And what can developers do, or game industry workers? And some of you will be like, oh, I don't need to listen to this part. I don't work in the game development industry. But these are things that we can give feedback on. We can call developers on when they're not doing them well. We can applaud developers when we see they are doing them well. And this is, again, just a very few things. One is keeping accessibility top of mind from square one. If the focus is to make an accessible game before a single line of code is even written, not only will the game be more fluidly an accessible experience, but it will also be less expensive to implement the accessibility. It's expensive to go at the end of a game and be like, oh, we didn't realize there's a whole group of people who can't play this game now. We have to quickly put some patches in and fix it. That costs money. It scraps work that was done before. So keeping it top of mind from the beginning is important. Pushing for studios to hire an employee or team of employees specifically to address accessibility at the company that these developers work for, that's really important too. I promise there is more than enough work there for one or a team of people that you can look at making the office more accessible, keep up to date on accessibility like in disability communities, constantly do new research as the tech changes. There's a lot going on there. Learn, be learning. If you can't convince your development studio to hire a full-time person, then bring in an accessibility specialist to speak to you or do an accessibility consultation with your team. That's really important too. And I am a shameless self-promoter who feels the need to point out that I do this kind of thing. So if anyone wants to get in contact with me about that, my email will be listed at the end of the talk, and I'll read it out for anyone who can't see the screen. Inform yourself about ableism. Like I was talking about before, there are a lot of scripts in video games that use really ableist language that alienate folks, and they probably don't mean to. Ask folks with disabilities how you can do better. There's something called disability simulation in a lot of creation of a lot of different products. And basically, it's along the lines of putting on gloves to see what it's like to play a game with limited mobility, putting on goggles to see what it's like to play your game blind. And while those can maybe help abled people understand what it's like, you can never really validate a product as being accessible unless the folks who need the accessible features say that it's accessible. So it's really important to know that those may aid in the process of making things more accessible, but folks with disabilities are the only ones who can really let you know. And they're vocal and they're out there. Twitter is like full of a disability community who's really excited about technology, and we're vocal and we're there. And you can also find people online and say, hey, we're looking for beta testers who identify as having disabilities. And if you do this, it's important to pay them. I can't stress this enough. In any area of life, If we are asking a marginalized community to educate us on how to make life more fair, more equal, more equitable for them, we need to take the first step of making sure that we're paying them to do that education, because it's hard work, it's exhausting work, and it's very deserving of pay. With any time that you're in a position of privilege or not and asking a marginalized community to do education for you on how to make things easier for them. Visit gameaccessibilityguidelines.com, the website that I mentioned earlier. It's specifically designed for developers. And present information always in more than one way. If there is a game mechanic, if there's a moment in your game where there's a visual cue that you have to do a thing, also put an audio cue. If you can, put more types of cues. If you have information like rifle ammo and pistol ammo dropping on the ground, don't just make them different colors, make them different shapes. Maybe put a letter or a symbol on them as well, so that folks with different types of neurodivergence, different types of color blindness can always see. I often have had people say that my slides look very boring, but it's because I took the simple step of running them through a colorblind filter before putting them here, so that everyone with every different type of color blindness can see what I'm putting up there. And it doesn't help everyone. There are still low vision folks who have trouble seeing my slides, but it's a step, right? So things like that are really important. In Candy Crush, they do a really good job of having different shapes and different colors on all of the gems until the bombs were introduced. The bombs are all different colors, but the same shape. So if you hit that point in the game, it's just game over for you if you're colorblind. I think they've changed it now. I don't know. But it's a really high percentage of folks that are colorblind, and they're often left out of the equation as well. And then don't let the fear of failure hold you back. I'm just checking my time, I've spoken to a lot of game developers who I'll say, why don't you focus more on accessibility in your games? And some of them say things like, it's not really my job, it's probably someone else's job. But the main reason I get is I don't know enough about it, and I don't want to do it wrong. There is so much to accessibility. I don't want to implement something wrong and then have to deal with lashback. What if I'm never good enough? What if it never gets to a point that it's accessible enough? And it won't. It just won't. Working in tech, we understand that technology is developing at such a rate that we constantly have to be learning if we work in tech. And it's like that with accessibility. As the technology changes, so do the needs and the accessible features. But that's okay. And sometimes people will screw up, and there will be very vocal people saying, hey, what about us? We want to play the game too. You totally screwed up, and this is horrible, and I'm never going to buy one of your games because I hate it, and you obviously don't care about people like me. It's going to happen. It happens. And you can't always make everyone happy. But the disability community at large is very happy when we see steps being taken in the right direction. So even if people get mad, I've learned that sometimes when advocating for yourself, volume is a thing that has to come into play. Sometimes I feel like I have to be really loud. I'll scream over and over and over again, why aren't there just wheelchair ramps everywhere? I can't get into places. I can't use the bathroom here. Why is this not? And the more that I have to say it and feel like I'm not being listened to, the louder and angrier and snarkier I tend to get. So understanding that when you run into somebody who's like, oh my God, I hate your game, you're horrible, you suck, you should all be fired, it's probably coming from a place of being ignored for a really long time. So I always advocate for those of us speaking out to be as diplomatic as we can, but those receiving feedback also need to understand that, don't let our volume intimidate you. Sometimes it's a symptom of having to repeat ourselves over and over. So that is pretty much my whole talk. I have some time for questions and comments now. In closing, I just want to say that everyone in this room has the ability to be a real advocate for change, a real agent of change for people's lives. All you need is to speak out to people. Talk on Twitter about this. Talk to your friends about it casually. When you're walking around playing the game demos here, ask the devs, what have you done in terms of accessibility? And they might say, oh, I don't know, we haven't really thought about it, and that's okay. That doesn't mean they've done anything wrong. It hopefully sparks something in them to start thinking about it and You can tell them to come talk to me. So for anyone who can't see the screen, you can find me online in a number of places. I'm a Twitch streamer, so basically all I do is I play video games and I talk about video games. It's kind of great. You can find me online at twitch.tv/LittleNavi_. That's spelled LittleNavi_. And you can find me through email at littlenavi@yahoo.com. I'm always on Twitter at LittleNavi_, and I have a YouTube channel with like 2 videos on it. There's not much, but this talk will be on it eventually. youtube.com/LittleNavi. So yeah, thanks so much for coming, and I think we have a bunch of time for questions. I didn't stop at all. My aphasia was pretty good. I always put a little bit of extra time in there for when I do have to stop with my brain injury. So yeah, does anyone have any questions for me or comments or want to talk about anything?
Sure. If this is a panel on accessibility, why isn't there a sign language interpreter present? Do they not have those for the convention at large?
So he just asked if this is a accessibility panel, why is there not a sign language interpreter here? That's a very good question. When I travel around and do talks about anything, I always request that there be an ASL interpreter, and I did do that with EGLX. There was a miscommunication near the end where they wanted me to recommend someone, and I told them I didn't know the area, but yeah, I don't want to give the impression that EGLX doesn't care about accessibility, because it's big that they cared enough to have me come here, and it's big that they went out of their way to accommodate all of my accessibility needs, and I do know that they do care, and it was something they attempted to do. And at the end, I was left with this decision: do I say that I won't go then because I want my talks to always be fully accessible? I don't know if you noticed, like I read things out on the screen. I really want things to be accessible, and it's always something that I request. And I don't usually do accessibility talks without ASL interpretation. Any of you who have seen me other places will know that. So do I just not go, or do I go anyway? So I decided to come, and I think that it's really important that anyone who cares about that contact EGLX in a very nice way, because they have been super, super accommodating, and they've let me know that accessibility is something they want to have a big focus on moving forward. So not only for this panel, but like all panels, a lot of conventions I go to just have ASL interpreters for all panels, and it should be a standard, in my opinion, for any type of conference. So that's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. I like your shirt. Anybody else have any questions? Yeah.
So I have anxiety, and I often find games with timing really anxiety-inducing. So games where you have to complete something in a certain amount of time, or there's a boss that it is timed. I liked Skyrim. Would you recommend any other games kind of in that genre that would be good for my anxiety?
So just in case anyone wasn't able to hear, she just asked, you have anxiety, and games with time limits and timed boss fights and things like that get really anxiety-inducing for you, and you're asking for recommendations. You said Skyrim works really well for you, and you're asking for recommendations of other types of games that might work. I personally don't have a ton of issue with timing anymore. If you reach out to me online, I can put together a list for you and let you know. Off the top of my head, Celeste right away is a good option. You can slow timers, and Shadow of the Tomb Raider also has the option to slow things down. I don't actually have any examples of specifically ones that don't have in the moment really quick reaction times required, but I can find out for you. Will you reach out to me later? Okay, yeah, I'll let you know. For sure. Yes.
So I follow your online content. It's really good, by the way. I love your.
I know, I've seen you places. Hi. How are you?
I've noticed you've worked hard to build a community that's not just accessible, but inclusive of people from a lot of different areas, marginalized groups, women, queer folks, people of color, that sort of thing. Has that been difficult for you, especially in the gaming community, which, as much as I love it, can have some toxicity where these things are concerned?
So correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just going to repeat all the questions so everyone can hear. Your question is, you follow me online, thank you. I've seen you at other conventions. You follow me online, and you notice that my community online is very inclusive for people of color, queer folks, women, other people from marginalized communities. And how do I do that? Or
How do you do that? Was it difficult for you to keep that up, especially in the game?
so you're right that game communities are notoriously toxic about these types of things. And you're right, or not right, but I really am glad that you've noticed that about my community. I know you're a part of it. And I would say that I didn't do anything really. I'm just a Twitch streamer. But there are two groups of people to thank for the fact that it has so successfully become this big blossoming community that's really inclusive. The first group of people is the moderating team I have involved, the people who manage the stream with me. There's been a lot of diversity. I've tried to bring in a lot of diverse people. There are a lot of areas in my life that I have a lot of privilege, and I can't see if there are issues, or I don't initially see if there are issues. So having a really diverse group of people moderate the stream with me and run it is really important. And we have zero tolerance for any type of bigotry, fascism, racism, homophobia. No, get out of here. You can do that other places. The other group of people that I think have created that space are the people who really don't like me. And that's basically, when I started streaming, I was like, I'm never going to be a big streamer. I'm never going to be successful. And then fast forward to now, and it's kind of just the only thing I do. And or one of the main things that I do. But I thought I would never be successful because people in gaming communities don't typically like people like me. People who are vocal about LGBTQIA inclusion, people who are women, people who have disabilities, people who are not afraid to talk about important political things and uplift people like me and support people from different marginalized communities. I know that's not something that people like very much in gaming circles. So I was like, oh no, everyone's gonna hate me and I'm just gonna get called an SJW all the time and no one's gonna come around. But you know what? In my corner of the internet, I'm not gonna have it. People can go to 99% of the rest of the internet and do that over there, but not in my space, right? And it made people really mad really quickly. All of these very vocal, loud people were like, you're an SJW, you're just a leftist, you're a bleeding heart liberal, you don't know, you don't know what you're annoying. And they said that so loudly that other queer folks on the internet were like, wait, that's a space? I want to go to that space. People who want to feel uplifted about the things that make them diverse and different. People from different marginalized communities were like, oh, she doesn't let anyone be even a little racist over there? Cool, I'll hang out there. Because it isn't very common. And that's what made everything grow so quickly, I think. So it's not really me. Oh, 5 minutes? Oh, 5 more minutes for talking, or I'm done? Okay, cool. Any more questions? Yes?
Like examples of mechanics or game systems which are particularly kind of troubling or inaccessible for people with disabilities?
Yeah.
Like, for example, PTs are a big thing. I was
Yeah.
wondering if there's any other examples.
Yes. Really, a lot of the assistive tech is problematic and inaccessible in that when we talk about accessibility, we need to factor in affordability. Folks who have disabilities already live a baseline, more expensive life than abled folks. Even here where my medical bills are paid for, I still have to pay for my wheelchair, maintenance on my wheelchair, in-home care. If I buy an Xbox, I need to spend the extra money for an adaptive controller, and then I have to spend the extra money for the switches, and then I have to spend the extra money to mount those switches. And so assistive technology really, really needs to keep in mind that a part of accessibility is affordability, and most assistive tech currently does not do that. So I would say that most assistive tech can be really problematic in that way and inaccessible. That's always the first thing that jumps to mind. People are like, oh great, there's this Xbox adaptive controller, which is amazing. And I do love it, and I want one. I've played with one a few times, and for someone who has limited mobility in my right hand, it would help a lot. But you know, it's $130 and then $80 for the first switch, and you can need up to 19 switches, and then it can become thousands of dollars of an investment. So, yeah. I hope that answers your question. Yes, hi.
Thank you for doing this, first of all. I
Oh,
didn't
thanks.
know of you, but I think you're awesome.
Oh, thank you. I think you're awesome. We were talking a little before.
Hopefully, this isn't too big a question for the time that we've got left, but you talked a little bit about neuroplasticity at the beginning.
Yes.
And I'm just wondering, like, how can you sort of try to put more of that? Like, I think by default games, you know, sort of work on those connected
Yes.
tissues and that already.
Mhm.
But for autism or any other types of disabilities like that, is there any work on sort of trying, like, having some real tangible improvements to neuroplasticity when, you know, as part of accessibility?
Like things that could be implemented that I don't currently see a lot
Well,
of.
a
like
way to actually know that you've like sort of
Right.
added more of it, right?
Right. Oh, that's so hard because neuroplasticity affects everything. It affects learning to move again. It affects breathing. It affects like anything that your brain can do. It's about rewiring the connections to make your brain, make your body do those things, and make your brain, make your mind do those things.
Is it being measured? Like, is there
So
a way
neural.
to say, oh, we've improved our accessibility
Yeah.
in that space?
I just realized I didn't repeat your question, and I didn't repeat your question either. The last question was obviously about if there were any problems with current tech that I could point out. So your question is about neuroplasticity and whether there's a way to measure whether the things being implemented in games are helping that.
Yeah,
Kinda?
yeah. So, because you know when you've added something like closed you know,
Yeah.
captioning or whatever that is, like you know that you've added those specific things. But in that area, when you're hopefully making it sort of easier for somebody to be able to understand it, like, is there a measure for that?
There isn't. There isn't actually a lot of science. Neuroscience is kind of a murky water of unknowns and uncertainties at this point. So even just knowing anything about neuroplasticity, let alone how to, aid in neuroplasticity, I could tell you some things that work well for me, and most of them are things that work well for other folks with other disabilities. So aiding in my neuroplasticity with my hand, making, things, the option to hold a button rather than tap it, soft locking on a character's back so that you don't have to use two joysticks helped me. But really any accessibility features will aid in neuroplasticity with people who can't do those things anymore. So yeah, I think I'm done, but I'll be hanging out there if anyone has any more questions, and you can also reach me online at all of these places. And I super appreciate you all coming out today and caring about this. That's great. I hope you enjoy the rest of EGLX.